Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with The Sun's political editor, Tom Newton-Dunn, and the Evening Standard columnist, Ayesha Hazarika. So good evening to both of you.
Hello.
Good evening.
So let's take a look then at what's on some of those front pages. And taking the piece, as the Metro refers to the Karelian ex-chief executive living in a luxury ski home. The Financial Times says that the fallen firm Karelian held just £29 million in its account as it headed towards bankruptcy. Police chief says 5-year-olds should be taught the dangers of knife crime. That's according to The Guardian. The Bayeux Tapestry is set to return to Britain, The Times has learned. The coroner urges CPS to reopen Poppy case, reports The Daily Telegraph. NHS losing doctors to migration red tape, that's on the front of The Eye. A message from the French on the front of the Daily Express, take more migrants. House of Horror, the Daily Star leads with the Californian parents who tied up and tortured their 13 children. And the Daily Mirror there writes, top Tory, give the jobless vasectomies. So lots to get our teeth into there with Ayesha Hazarika and Tom Newton-Dunn. And the crisis over Karelian continues to dominate at least a couple of the front pages. You've picked out the Metro's front page, which focuses on how much money that some of the chief executives have walked away from, or some of the executives at least, while others are worried that they're going to get their wages paid.
Yeah, I think the first we heard of Richard Howson's staggering £660,000 payoff yesterday. I was pretty sure that was going to be where the story was going to be going for the next 2 or 3 days. And this is the guy who ran Karelian, now we know ran it almost into the ground, was relieved of his services last October and walked away with this agreement that he would get paid, we believe, in instalments over a course of about a year, £660,000, while, of course, hundreds, if not thousands, I should probably say, live in grave fear of their jobs tomorrow. The government have agreed to keep on paying those Karelian employees, some 20,000 of them, who carry out jobs, services for the government in hospitals, prisons, etc. But those employed by the private sector, and Karelian has this huge, vast reach in logistics and construction up and down the economy, they're not so lucky, and their money will run out. They had a special 48 hours pay guaranteed by the government, and their money runs out tomorrow night. Those people are going to be without a job, without any income at all, in their thousands. Now, compare that to Richard Howson, and there you have the Metro showing his chalet there in the French Alps, which has 6 bedrooms and a hot tub. When he's not there, he's at his £2 million home in Yorkshire. It is simply, I think, unsustainable for Mr Howson to keep his £660,000 golden goodbye for effectively collapsing one of the biggest construction companies we have. And pleased to say the government, it took them 24 hours, but they finally decided they might have to do something about going after this money today. Well, they have
fast-tracked an investigation, haven't they, to look into the actions of the directors and the executives, haven't they? But do you think, Tom's right there, that some gesture at least has to be made by some of these executives that have walked away with cash?
I mean, this is an absolutely disgraceful scandal, and this is, a failure of corporate governance, and actually it's a failure of capitalism. You can see why so many people are so angry with the way things work. Remember, this is a huge scandal. The taxpayer is going to have to come and bail out a lot of things. If you look at the services they provided, school meals getting delivered, fire services are having to go in and deliver school meals. There's going to be a huge ramification, and there are so many questions that need to be answered, and this is very complicated and interconnected. There's a number of questions. For a start, why did KPMG, the auditors, give that company a clean bill of health when they knew there were problems with the balance sheets? The banks that were sort of lending knew that there were problems because they actually stopped lending at some point. And of course, why did the government continue to give this company contracts when they had issued loads of profit warnings? And their corporate governance structure, why was it signed off that these bosses were allowed to hoover out a lot of cash quite recently, clearly for themselves? Now, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, has actually demanded that they give back their bonuses, that it's not just a goodwill gesture, but it's actually morally the right thing to do. And I think he is absolutely right. You know, time after time, we see these huge companies fail, and the people who pay the brunt are people who lose their jobs. There's going to be a lot of small businesses that probably go under because they will only get a pound. You know, the amount of money they will get back is tiny, so they themselves could face bankruptcy. And I think people are just sick and tired of this.
Indeed, and let's take a look at the FT's take on it as well, because they're drilling into the figures, aren't they? They're saying that Karelian had just £29 million in its final days. I mean, it sounds like a huge amount of money, but when you consider the number of projects that they were involved with,
the FT
that's not a lot of liquidity, is it?
The FT have got hold of some fascinating financial papers, liquidation papers, which show just what an extraordinary state Karelian got itself into. 29 million quid left in the bank, which is not very much when you're paying 20,000 people and running a massive company across the entire country. But they owed to various creditors, various banks, £1.3 billion. If Karelian had kept on going for another day, kept on trading for another day, there'd be some £29 million into the red, and they'd be going overdrawn. And the sheer scale of their financial car crash, it really sort of piles up. And I think, Ayesha set out some of the problems there. I think we need to be quite careful when going through this, because this is, Ayesha's absolutely right, a corporate failing on an enormous scale. It's up there with Lehman's in terms of an absolute catastrophe. Companies like this really aren't supposed to fail because they're simply too big. And one of the options open to the government over the weekend, this intense series of talks over the weekend, was, shall we stop them from failing? Shall we just walk in, bail them out and keep this thing up and running? Now, in my view, that would have been an even bigger scandal, because you would then also be rewarding, greed, negligence, whatever.
But do you think the government should answer those questions
with taxpayers' money?
Continue to give those contracts after the profits warning last year?
That is another interesting point. So we've been asking those questions, very hard questions, of the government for the last 2 days. And actually, I'm not entirely convinced that this Labour line, which was a line put out by the Labour Party on Sunday afternoon, why is it the government kept on piling these contracts onto Karelian when they knew they were in financial trouble? It's a fair question to ask. In my view, it's been answered. And the reason is, since July, which I think the first profit warning was issued, the government has some 450 contracts with Karelian. Since July, 8 have been issued. 7 of them with the government, 1 with Labour-controlled Leeds Council, as a small point of trivia. And all of those are joint ventures. In other words, they're with another company, and if
do you think that's a
failed,
satisfactory answer, the fact that other partners can take up the slack?
One more just quick point to finish that off. If you don't give contracts to Karelian when you know they're in trouble, they've got profit, they're not getting bankrupt, but they're saying we've got problems, all you will do, if you deprive them of that work, deprive them of that income, all you could do is hasten their end even quicker and guarantee people will be out of jobs, rather than giving a final chance to sort out their stuff.
That is a good enough answer, but I think, as I said, it's very, very complicated. This goes to a much bigger question about whether this type of capitalism is actually working, this type of structure of governance, and also it raises a big question.
And that's right. Corporate governance is obviously very different to what the government do.
But where the government comes in, they should be, if it's taxpayers' money and it's running services, the government and all the civil servants and all the advisors and all the ministers should be watching this like a hawk. And I partly think, because the government's been so distracted by other things, namely Brexit and lots of other things, I think they've taken their eye off the ball on this.
And when you say watching like a hawk, it's interesting, when you were talking about Lehman Brothers, reminders of the financial crash, lots of measures were put into place regarding banks in terms of how much cash they held onto at any one time to stop this kind of thing happening. Should that happen with big companies that take on big public service contracts?
This is a huge question that needs to be looked at. And in fact, not just Labour people, a lot of actually quite respected business analysts and economists have been asking this question today, because lots of people are taking it back to precisely that, the 2008 scandal, when again, the government did step in because we didn't want our banking to fall off a cliff edge. And I think they didn't want to do that this time, although we are going to have to pick up a bill quite rightly for all the public services. But I think
we're paying people's wages rather than bailing out Fred the Shred Goodwin to have a nice life.
Which is why it's the right thing to do in this case. But there's a fundamental question at which I think it's a political and philosophical question which needs to be asked of future governments. Is it right to outsource so many public services to private companies who are driven by profit, and they have to cut and cut and cut, and then these kind of things always happen?
What do you think the answer to that is?
I don't think we should be doing it.
And what do you think?
What, none?
Well, I think there's
no more outsourcing?
I think we've got to really look at it. I don't think when you look at Virgin, which has failed in lots of sectors, whether it's on the East Coast.
Should government run everything?
Well, I don't think it's as binary, but I don't think this is working either. I think we have outsourced too much. And interestingly, if you look at healthcare, lots of the services that are outsourced to the private sector, they don't end up having a particularly good result in the end. There's lots of problems because when you cut
There's a hospital in Peterborough run by the private sector that has one of the best records in the country.
But then there was a train survey done and actually lots of the state-run operators provided the best service.
Do you remember British Rail?
No, but that's a
shocking
thing.
service.
I'm talking about services now. I don't think you can say that lots of private companies are delivering brilliant services, whether it's Virgin Care, whether it's Southern Rail, whether it's Virgin Trains. I think there are fundamental problems and issues that we need to look at again. And that's not saying, oh, just nationalise everything, but clearly this is not working particularly well.
OK, so I'm going to move us on because
yes,
we haven't got very much time, but lots of questions just immediately for workers, of course, but then broader in the future about how these things are managed. But in the meantime, let's crack on. On the front page of the Daily Telegraph, there's a story about Boris that's on the front there, bottom left-hand corner.
Would you like to talk about Boris, or shall I talk about
Why don't you kick off with Boris?
Boris has, yet again in the last couple of days, made a big old song and dance about his famous promise on the side of his big red bus to give the £350 million a week we send to Brussels back to the health service. Or actually, he said public services such as the NHS.
Didn't he also say that it was an underestimate, that figure?
Yesterday, in an interview in The Guardian, or in fact in today's Guardian, he said that, in fact, he got his figures wrong and he's very sorry. What he should have said, 400 million a week or perhaps 450 million a week, because that is by how much our contributions to the EU are going up by in future years. Interestingly, we asked Theresa May today, or her spokesman, at the normal lobby briefings, whether she concurred with Boris Johnson's mathematical failure and the fact there should be a whole lot more money that he should have promised on the side of his bus. And she was very, very swiftly moving a million miles away from him, would not at all back up his suggestion, because that great £350 million claim was, of course, so divisive during the referendum campaign. Fast forward on today, Boris isn't giving up. Oh, no, he's going to war with Theresa May over this. He's really digging in. And his people close to Boris, which normally means their special advisors or close aides, are saying Theresa May now has to promise at least £100 million a week of that money that we will no longer have to pay to Brussels to the NHS. And that is upping the stakes.
So has he made a calculation, A, that he's going to take on Theresa May, but also that he feels that there are going to be enough people that just want to hear that kind of pledge, that they're going to back him?
I think this is all about him trying to make a pitch for the leadership for the Conservative Party. He's doubling down on that, as Tom said, very, very controversial claim. And many people fear that the economy will actually tank and there won't be that amount of money for the NHS. And also, I think what it shows is how weak Theresa May is. Boris Johnson can just basically troll Theresa May every single day of the week, whether it was before the party conference when he wrote this sort of essay saying how rubbish her Brexit strategy was and how weak her leadership is. Now he stands up and he knows the NHS is in crisis and he needles her again. And she's so weak, she couldn't even move him as it was briefed that she wanted to do in the reshuffle. She can't even move the failing health secretary. He goes in to get a sacking and he swaggers out with a promotion. It just shows that poor Theresa May, how her leadership is just achingly weak.
Well, she's not giving him this £100 million a week for the NHS. I mean,
well, she can't.
She's at least today saying,
he is needling her. He is needling her. He's needling her, and he's throwing red meat to the Brexiteers on his side of the party.
That much is definitely. One quick point, of course, is
that
this entire row about how much money goes to the NHS when we're not going to be stopping contributions to the EU budget until 2021, because that's how long it will take to do the transition periods. And quite frankly, both of them may not be in the cabinet by then. Who would suggest such a thing? So
Tom Newton-Dunn.
This entire thing may be hugely irrelevant.
OK, we really must go to a break. Lots to talk about, though, after the break, including has the Bitcoin bubble burst? We'll tell you more about that in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, the Evening Standard columnist Ayesha Hazarika and The Sun's political editor Tom Newton-Dunn. And we're going to turn our attention to the Daily Telegraph to kick off this section. This is the case of Poppy Worthington. It's actually the second day in a row that the Telegraph has led on this story. And just before we get into that, just to mention they haven't put Karelian on their front page, interestingly. I'm sure there's plenty of coverage inside. But on that main story, they're saying that the coroner is urging the CPS to reopen this case of this 13-month-old girl who died, and that the coroner delivered their findings yesterday.
Well, this is an absolutely horrific case, and it's had quite a lot of publicity because there have been police failings in terms of the police have admitted that they mishandled the case, they didn't collect evidence quickly enough. The details are particularly lurid. There have not, there hasn't been the chance to sort of take this forward. But the coroner has come out and basically said that he is convinced that the father, Mr. Worthington, had abused the daughter, but then she died later in unsafe sleeping conditions in the double bed in which her father had abused her.
He believed he died of asphyxia, I think they said.
Yeah, that's right. And the coroner is saying that he thinks there's enough information, there's enough circumstantial evidence to open up this case. And that is also the view of the former principal legal advisor to the DPP, Alison Levitt QC, who says there's nothing inherently weak about circumstantial evidence, and there have been plenty of cases prosecuted on circumstantial evidence. But this case is so horrendous. We should also just state very importantly that the father, Mr. Worthington, has always maintained his innocence. He's actually under police protection, as you can imagine. This is such an emotive case that, people are absolutely enraged about it. But there's a number of things. Look, there's been so many cases recently where people are starting to have real worries about the justice system, and this seems such an egregious crime. And, it seems that the police have messed up in it as well. So I think there will be a public appetite for reopening this if it's possible.
The similarities with the War Boys case are really large in that a police force simply was unable, through really negligence or lack of resources, or quite possibly both, to prosecute something which has been, the writing's been on the wall for a very long time. War Boys committed dozens of rapes. He was only put away for 10 or 12 of them. 3 different hearings now, judicial hearings, have found Worthington certainly culpable for his daughter's death, yet still the police have been unable to do a single thing about it. And I suppose we should say, of course, Mr. Worthington says he had nothing to do with her death and he's entirely innocent, and indeed he is until a court of law proves otherwise. But there are some, horrific elements to this case that defy understanding how they couldn't be sort of, further brought forward. Why on earth the police have not picked up the evidence, investigated at the time, which is the accusations against them.
OK, yes, and the coroner pushing today for the case to be reopened, the mother yesterday. And let's move on, though, to the Sun, because you're also interested in talking about the CPS once again. This is Emily Maitlis, who has been talking about how her life has been affected by a stalker.
This was the sentencing of Emily Maitlis's stalker, a chap called Edward Vines, in a court in Oxford today. He was put in prison for the second time for stalking Emily Maitlis. They're both 47 years old. They met, I think they're both students at Cambridge, and as you can see, our subject says, for 27 years he's been stalking Emily. And she had to give evidence today at the sentencing hearing to explain the effect upon her. And she said it's been incredibly stressful. Wherever I go out, I'm worried about meeting strangers. I think he might be there. It's had an effect on my marriage. It's put huge strain on my marriage, as of course it would. And he was even, this most extraordinary sort of revelation, this bloke Vines was even able to write to Emily from his prison cell when he was locked up the first time round. How can a justice system preside over that? And I think Ayesha's absolutely right. You put this case together with the Worthington case, with the War Boys case, and there's something quite systemic going wrong here. Time after time, bad guys, villains, although we have to say Worthington denies any wrongdoing, are getting away with things which horrify the general public. Is it police resources? Is it Crown Prosecution Service resources? Or is it a justice policy and a government system? We talked about this on sort of similar programmes. There have been 6 different justice secretaries in the last 7 years, and the Tories and the coalition can't decide whether they want an authoritarian justice system of the more traditional sort that, in fact, the Labour Party carried out when they were in office, or a more liberal one where people don't go to prison for so long. And as a result, the thing has been allowed to drift and it has no coherence.
Do you think that's it? It's about not being able to decide what direction to take, or is it about resources, do you think?
I think it's actually more fundamental than that. I think the justice system has got a real blind spot when it comes to particular crimes, I think particularly against women as well. These guys who are stalkers or people who do domestic violence, they tend to become fixated with somebody. They also tend to have a repeat pattern of behaviour. There was a horrible case a couple of weeks ago where a man who'd been let out of prison killed his third partner, and the police knew that he had a history of this. So I think part of it is the criminal justice system, which again, it's a set of rules and laws which has grown up over centuries. It's been very, very male dominated. It started to change in terms of trying to be a bit more sympathetic and empathetic to sort of violence against women and sexual violence against women. But I think it really has a long way to go.
OK, we're going to leave it there. I know there's a story about Bitcoin you're keen to get to. We haven't got time,
teased the
but you're
Bitcoin
coming
story.
back. Oh, we did.
That's
we'll have to stay with us. Come back at 11:30. It's an hour long. They'll stay with us. I know they will. They're very loyal. Ayesha and Tom, thanks very much indeed for now. Do stay with us, though. Coming up on... Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what's making the headlines with The Sun's political editor, Tom Newton-Dunn, and the Evening Standard columnist, Ayesha Hazarika. Hello to both of you.
Hello again.
Hello.
So let's take a look then at those front pages and taking the piece, as the Metro refers to the Karelian ex-chief executive living in a luxury ski home. The Financial Times says that the fallen firm Karelian held just £29 million in its accounts as it headed towards bankruptcy. Police chief says 5-year-olds should be taught the dangers of knife crime. That's the headline for The Guardian. The Bayeux Tapestry is set to return to Britain, The Times has learned. The coroner urges the CPS to reopen the Poppy case, reports the Daily Telegraph. NHS is losing doctors to migration red tape. That's according to the I newspaper. A message from the French on the front of the Daily Express: take more migrants. House of Horror. The Daily Star leads with the Californian parents who tied up and tortured their 13 children. The Daily Mirror writes, top Tory give the jobless vasectomies. Newsnight presenter has told a judge a stalker is ruining her life. That's on the front page of The Sun there. And the Daily Mail says it's a sad reflection of Britain that the Prime Minister has appointed a Minister for the Lonely. And the paper says that covers 9 million people. So let's chat through some of those stories on those front pages, as well as some of them inside as well, with Tom Newton-Dunn and Ayesha Hazarika. And we're going to pick up on the Karelian stories, which again makes the front pages of several of the newspapers. You picked out the Metro. I'm not going to take the risk of saying that headline again, but essentially it's focusing on a very serious story, though, isn't it? It's focusing on the kind of money and bonuses that some at the top of the company got, while now workers are concerned about even having a job or getting paid at all.
Absolutely, and this is a great, front page taking the piece. It kind of will capture the anger that a lot of workers and actually the public will feel about the fact that these bosses have, run this company into the ground. There are thousands of people whose jobs are on the line, and there's going to be a knock-on effect of probably thousands of businesses that they worked with who may never get their money back and may face bankruptcy as well. But the bosses are, got big bonuses. They have sort of disappeared, and there's a picture here of one of them who has this sort of ski chalet. And again, the contrast between the bosses and the workers is very, very stark. I'm sure the bosses will be, very upset about what's happened to their company, but they're all right, Jack. They made sure they got big bonuses. That optic is very reminiscent, actually, of Philip Green with his yacht after BHS collapsed. And there were, thousands of workers worried about their pensions and jobs, and you can see the opulence that some have. But look, there are huge questions that need to be explored about Karelian and this failure. And it's a huge corporate failure. It's probably the biggest corporate failure we've seen since the banking crisis. There are questions about, what did the banks know? Because the banks knew that something was up a while ago. Why did the government continue to give them contracts to run public services when they knew that there were profits warning? Why did KPMG, the auditors, give this company a clean bill of health when clearly they were in trouble? And what happened to the internal corporate governance, which allowed the remuneration committee to sign off these huge bonuses when there were all these profit warnings and things were going wrong? So this is a huge scandal. It will have a huge knock-on effect and there'll be big political ramifications. Labour is calling for these bosses to give back their bonuses, and it raises the issue of privatising public services.
Yeah, and as you say, so many issues, not just looking at what went wrong, but also what should happen in the future with similar contracts. On the issue of the bonuses, first of all, as Ayesha was saying there, Jeremy Corbyn saying they should give those bonuses back. I mean, do you think he's right saying that?
Well, Richard Howson is the chap there on the front page of the Metro and a few other papers, and that's his chalet there in the French Alps. He's the guy who was relieved of his services in October last year when Karelian was very close indeed to going to the wall. And obviously, he's just gone to the wall 2-3 months later. And he walked away with a £660,000 golden goodbye. Part of his contract, we understand, is still being paid out in instalments, and contractually, that money has to continue. It is, for me, almost now inconceivable that he's going to get all of that money. The public pressure is already building to the point that the government, who were a little bit slow-footed on this yesterday, today they came out and said, actually, now we are examining how we're going to look at certainly going after the directors to punish them if there was any wrongdoing, banning them for future directorships, and potentially, if we can get some of this money back, that they all seem to be trousering left, right and centre. I think to go into just one or two of Ayesha's points, we've got to be slightly careful packaging all this up as a political failure, a government failure. Companies go wrong. Sometimes they don't work. Sometimes they've got to go bust. And that's right. That's what happens in capitalism. Not every company works. When companies are this big and the consequences of their failings are so large, that's when the government has to be ready. And quite frankly, it's not doing a bad job to step in and protect people, the people who work for public services getting paid. However, what you do also have to do if you're the government is, if there is wrongdoing, if failure is being rewarded, with this bloke still going skiing whenever he wants his lovely chalet, that has to be stopped. And the parallels of BHS are really interesting. That was, the corporate failure was manifest there. The government promises new rules, being very, very tough to come in and make sure that, you know, if there was wrongdoing, people go to prison for it.
But what about the government themselves?
Here.
Because the other point that Ayesha was making about contracts being awarded to this company after a profits warning, awarded by the government.
See, again on that, I haven't got a problem with, and I'll tell you exactly why. The government had 450 different contracts with Karelian. I mean, that you could argue about by saying, well, why are you putting so many eggs in one basket? But, you know, this was an enormous company doing apparently not a bad job. They had 450 of those contracts. Since July, which is the first profit warning, they only signed 8 different contracts. By the way, one of those government contracts was the Labour-run Leeds council.
That was a lot of money.
But those contracts start with joint ventures with other companies who could come in and pick up the mess. But secondly, the last thing you want to do really to a company that's in financial trouble is deprive them of income, because you are guaranteed to send them to the wall.
Keep the company going.
Unless you try.
2 points on that, I would say. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said sometimes businesses go wrong and they fail, and that's capitalism. I completely agree with that. I've worked in businesses myself, which had issued profits warnings. That's part of business. The difference is they were not delivering vital public services, which can't just fail. There's a difference between a business failing, a commercial entity, and public services failing when the state then needs to step in.
Well, that's what's happening, though. The state is stepping in and doing not a bad job of it so far. It's very worrying for people, but the state is there.
But that is why people are worried, because this happening on such a big scale, you know, you can't sort of say, hooray, this is great, the state stepped up. In that case, you know, I don't think the system...
But it is good the state's stepping up.
No, but I don't think it's a good thing that so many contracts were given. I mean, why have you got a situation now where school meals are going to have to be
8 contracts out of 450 were given.
Loads of contracts are given in terms of this stuff. And also, the government, when it's taxpayers' money, should be watching these contracts, particularly with private ones, with eyes like a hawk, because there is a record of failure in terms of these PFIs going wrong. And by the way, this is not just a party, you know, Labour got into trouble with a lot of PFIs as well. Okay. These PFIs have got a massive history of going wildly out of control and the government then having to come and pick up the pieces.
OK, let's turn the attention back on the company for the moment. moment because the front of the Financial Times talks about how much money, how much cash it had, £29 million, they say, and given the size of the company, that's not an awful lot when you're paying out to loads of different suppliers.
The FT have done a very good job digging into some of the insolvency documents to get to the bottom of precisely how big the problem was. And they found that there was only 29 million quid of cash left in Karelian's bank account. It sounds lots to you and I, but you also find out here that from the FT's front page that £1.3 billion was owed to the banks. And in fact, if Karelian had been trading for one more day, they would be £29 million into the red. So they were in dire parlous, financial states. And Ayesha does have a point. Where was the regulation? Why was this not looked at a bit closer? How could they have built up debts at £1.3 billion, all of which are going to be questions that will have to be answered.
Indeed. And we'll move on, if that's all right, Ayesha. But, yeah, questions over whether or not companies like that should have the same kind of regulations that perhaps banks do or something after the financial crash. Let's move on to the Daily Mail, though, because their main story there has taken your interest. And this is about a Minister for the Lonely being appointed.
This is actually, the Minister for the Lonely is one part of a very interesting thing that Theresa May is doing tomorrow, and that is announcing she's going to accept pretty much wholesale the findings of a fascinating study done by the late Labour MP Jo Cox, who was, of course, murdered a few days before the EU referendum, who did a big study into loneliness and rightly flagged it up as not just a bit of an unfortunate problem, but a huge societal problem that costs the state a fortune in terms of the medical problems. Loneliness is as harming to people's health as smoking is, for example. But so there's huge economic costs to the government, there's societal costs, and some of the figures that Jo Cox came up with absolutely horrifying. So one, for example, that the Daily Mail picked up on their front page. 200,000 elderly people go weeks without talking to a friend or relative. The figure is actually 8 weeks without talking to a friend or relative. It's absolutely incredible. 9 million people living in isolation, and a whole load of those people are suffering from mental health. Not just old people sitting alone at home whose kids have forgotten about them, but mental health sufferers who are traumatised and cannot maybe go out.
So I'm sure a lot of people will welcome the fact that there will be a disappointment to try and deal with it, but what can you do about it? I mean, how do you go about...
Well, it's such a growing issue. I mean, the minister who's been appointed is actually a very, very good minister, Tracy Crouch, in the spirit of Jo Cox, more in common. Tracy and I are actually very good friends. I'm Labour, she's Conservative. We went to university together, and she's a very open-minded sort of person, so I think she's exactly the right person to be sort of leading this. I think there's some practical things that can be done, but it is difficult to turn this around overnight. You have to look at the conditions in which we live. I mean, for a lot of old people, television is their, biggest company. Lots of people don't have their family near them in the same way that they used to. We've become quite spread out across the United Kingdom for various reasons.
Or in other countries, countries like Japan that have, put huge amounts of stock in looking after their older people.
I mean, look at, sort of even things like home care and cuts to the local authorities. Lots of people, when their carer comes in, there's 15-minute slots, which is not even enough time to make a cup of tea and have a chat, So there's lots of things that, there's lots of problems. In terms of the solutions, there's some ideas like, organising meetups in local cafes, trying to organise more community activities. I've read about some quite interesting ideas about intergenerational things where older people that have bigger houses, sometimes get students to come and live with them. The students get a better rent, the older people get some sort of company. But I think you have to be quite creative about this, and it's not an easy thing to fix, but it's incredibly important. And as well as elderly people, new mothers, disabled people, refugees, they're all groups identified in this report as being socially isolated.
So maybe this is an important first step in trying to get to grips with what's obviously a big problem in this country. We are going to take a break. Lots to talk about coming up, though, including, does the White House doctor's assessment of President Trump's health add up? We'll discuss that after the break. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, Ayesha Hazarika and Tom Newton-Dunn. And we're going to turn to the front of The Sun. It's a story that's picked up by a few of the papers. And it's Emily Maitlis talking about the impact that her stalker has had on her life.
Yeah, this is a shocking story, really. This is a stalker who's been plaguing poor old Emily for 27 years, as our front page banner says there. ever since they were at university together. And this guy's been a fiend and a weirdo ever since. Yet 27 years on, she is still having to write painful long statements in court.
Which I think we can see, actually, just if we have a look at the page 5 of The Sun, there is the statement there. Sorry, go on, Tom.
Which we've ragged out in full, explaining quite the toll it's had on her life and her marriage. When she goes out in public, she's worried about meeting strangers in case it's him. It's had pressure on the relationship he has with her husband, and it's made work very hard too. I mean, I know Emily, she's a friend of mine. I was in touch with her tonight just to let her know that she was going to be on our front page, and I can tell you she hates every second of this. And the point is this, and she makes this point in her statement, that she and her husband and now her family have been trying to pursue this guy Vines with the CPS's help for 27 years. This is the second time he's gone to prison. He was even able to stalk her from his prison cell last year, or in 2016, by writing her 3 different notes. Why the justice system is incapable of finding some sort of course of action to stop him from harassing her and her family by not just keeping him off the streets or finding a way of preventing him from doing this, but even sending letters from inside prison is absolutely beyond me. And the tragedy is, Emily's not the only one. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of women out there almost certainly being let down by the same totally failing justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of a lot of charities that deal with sort of violence against women sort of say that harassment and stalking is just not, we're not really dealing with it properly yet in terms of how the criminal justice system responds to it and what police can do. And often with these types of perpetrators, they do become really fixated on somebody, obviously, because they're sort of stalkers. And it doesn't just go away. The victim lives with that constant fear, anxiety. They can never quite sort of relax, particularly if it's, at night. So, I mean, it's an unbelievable story. And I think she's incredibly brave because she's cracking on presenting Newsnight and
she did Newsnight last night without missing a stroke.
Yeah,
True
real pro.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's very quickly look at the front of the Telegraph, because I know there's a story about Boris Johnson that you want to talk about there, but we also want to talk about Donald Trump. So let's briefly talk about what Boris Johnson's been talking about this week. He's revisiting the amount of money that should go to the NHS.
Yes, that famous bus with the £350 billion pounds, which, was seen as very, very divisive and very controversial. Boris has decided to revisit it and double down on it and say that actually the number should be higher in terms of what should go to the NHS. And he is basically demanding that the Conservatives give the NHS £1 million a week, which would be great, but they're just not in a position to do that. And as far as I'm aware, it looks like he's just continuing to troll poor Theresa May because he knows that she's weak and he wants that top job next.
Well, yes, it's interesting, isn't it, politically, but also defending a figure that some people felt was indefensible.
Yeah, but from Boris's perspective, his entire reputation, career, future job prospects is based on being able to... He's so delivered, he's so intensely wound up with this figure now. He was the one that stood outside the bus day in, day out through the campaign. If he can't deliver that, his career and his credibility is kaput forevermore.
So he wants to be able to blame others for not delivering
Theresa May beautifully is now saying, I'm sorry, Boris, I'll give you this, that and everything else, even the job of Foreign Secretary, which comes with it the best office in Whitehall overlooking St James's Park. I will not give you that. So there's a tremendous clash now building between those two over this totemic figure. OK,
we've got a minute to discuss Donald Trump's medical report, which is extraordinary. And that headline is fabulous, isn't it? Revealed, Trump takes hair loss pills, is a stone too heavy, but hasn't got false teeth or dementia.
So this is the medical briefing that we've had from Dr. Jackson, his doctor, who has recently said that he doesn't have any cognitive issues, including Alzheimer's. He scores 30 out of 30
really interesting
on a cognitive
he did
test.
Deal with that, though. Yeah. It questioned about...
I'll tell you what's the big question
on
is...
Trump's request.
If he has a clear... is he tweeting all of that nonsense with a clear head? If he's got no cognizant problems, who is going and stealing his phone and doing all those insane tweets?
So, interestingly, Trump says, give me a cognitive test so you can prove I'm sane. So his doctor, who's a very loyal serving member of the US Navy and does what he's told, came up with a cognitive test, and it's important to tell you about the details of this.
OK, quickly if you can.
That the president took involves 30 questions, asking the participant to name some farmyard animals draw the hands of a clock and recall a few words. This makes him able to converse. Normally, it does not prove, I underline, not prove, he's not a psychopath or a sociopath. However,
what he would say is he's a very stable genius with a massive big button.
There is an even more important piece of information revealed to us by someone who's not too far away from us to speak with, intense medical training.
It's not me.
Who tells us that the blood pressure that was stated for Trump, 122/74, for a 17-stone man aged 71, clearly unfit, is simply impossible. That is the blood pressure of a fit 30-year-old. So there is a conspiracy underway.
Trump is getting put in a diet, which we're all good. I think that's good advice for us all.
Thanks, Ayesha. That's lovely by you.
Great.
You said that
I said you were looking lovely tonight.
Nice to see you both.
What I really said.
We're out of time, but Tom and Ayesha, lovely to see you as ever. Thank you.
Very much.